The mother walked to work every day to save money for her son's medication. But one day, a man gave her a ride, and when she found out who he was, she couldn't believe her ears. Sarah and Basilio got married right after high school, buoyed by youthful love and dreams of a future together. In the small, cozy house they rented on the outskirts of town, every corner was imbued with their happiness and plans for the future. More than anything, they wanted to have a child. But as the years passed, their cherished dream remained unfulfilled. Every month, Sarah felt disappointed but never lost hope. One morning, when Sarah wasn't expecting anything unusual, she saw two bright lines on the test. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes, but when she realized what it meant, her heart trembled with joy. She had waited for this moment for so long that tears of happiness streamed down her cheeks. She immediately thought of Basilio and decided she wanted to tell him the news in person. Basilio was already at work, and Sarah decided to wait until evening to surprise him. She began preparing his favorite dinner, juicy cutlets, fresh vegetables, and apple pie, which he adored. She spent the whole day bustling about and dreaming of Basilio's joy at the news. She imagined his smile, his happiness, and tears of joy. As evening approached, Sarah eagerly awaited her husband's return. Time seemed to drag, and she frequently glanced at the clock. But as darkness fell, anxiety began to creep into her heart. It had been over an hour since Basilio usually came home. Suddenly, the doorbell rang. Sarah hurried to open it, thinking it was her husband, but two unfamiliar men in work clothes stood on the threshold. They looked serious and somewhat confused. Sarah's heart sank when she saw their faces. "Are you Mrs. Prieto?" one of the men asked, and Sarah nodded, feeling cold fear penetrating her heart. "We're very sorry, but there was an accident at the construction site. Your husband fell from a great height. We did everything we could, but—" The man's words turned into a buzz in Sarah's ears. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The world around her spun, and she felt her legs giving way. All her dreams, all the joy and hope crumbled in an instant. That night, the house, which that morning had been full of hope and joy, was filled with silence and pain. Sarah returned to the untouched dinner in the empty kitchen, and tears streamed down her face. She felt life slipping through her fingers. Sarah couldn't believe what had happened. She felt ill and barely made it to her neighbor Mrs. Rodriguez's door to ask for help. 10 minutes later, an ambulance arrived, and Sarah was taken to the hospital. For several days, she couldn't regain consciousness, and the doctors fought desperately for Sarah and her baby's lives. Fortunately, they managed to save them both. Soon the girl woke up, but her emotional state left much to be desired. Sarah fell into a deep depression. She had loved her husband, whom she had known since childhood, and now she understood that she had lost not only her spouse, but also her most faithful friend. Every day she cried inconsolably, remembering the moments spent with Basilio. The doctors urged her to pull herself together because constant sadness could harm the baby, but Sarah couldn't help herself. She was very anxious and scared. She couldn't imagine raising the baby alone. Moreover, the pregnancy was not going well. Sarah constantly felt physical discomfort and weakness. She had only one wish: to rest. As a result, the delivery was very difficult, and the baby was born weak and spent the first 10 days on the brink of life and death. Sarah barely survived too. She ended up in intensive care and was in a coma for a while. The doctors had to fight desperately for her life. It was made worse by the fact that Sarah had lost the will to return to a reality where she was alone with an infant. However, her doctor constantly talked to her about how much her baby needed her. One day, his words reached Sarah's consciousness, and she began to recover quickly. "How is my baby?" the young mother asked with tears in her eyes as soon as she regained consciousness. "He's better now," the doctor replied with a smile. "We had to work hard to save his life, but now he's out of danger." Sarah managed a weak smile. "It's all my fault," she said a moment later, and tears began to fall from her inflamed eyes. "You shouldn't blame yourself," the doctor said wisely. "The circumstances were beyond your control. The past can't be changed, but you have the present and the future. Your baby's fate is in your hands." Sarah nodded in response and tried to smile again. "I'll do everything I can," she said. "That's wonderful," the doctor said. "And for a start, you could give him a name." Sarah brought her hands to her heart and whispered softly, "I chose it long ago. My son's name will be Marito." The doctor smiled, feeling the tenderness of the moment. "That's a beautiful name." 3 weeks later, Sarah and Marito had fully recovered and were finally discharged from the hospital. Sarah's mother arrived to help her daughter take care of the baby. Sarah was doing well. She learned to feed Marito, change his diapers, and rock him to sleep. Marito grew up weak and sickly. Sending him to kindergarten when he got a little older was out of the question. Marito often caught colds, and Sarah feared any breeze when they were outside. Later, it turned out that Marito had certain developmental delays. Sarah noticed that his peers were much smarter and quicker than he was. When Marito turned 3, he still only spoke a few words and often mumbled something incomprehensible when he wanted to express his thoughts. The boy also had problems with motor skills and coordination. He found it hard to pick up small objects, and he often tripped and fell over seemingly nothing. When given a toy, he didn't understand what to do with it and behaved strangely. He could spend hours spinning a car wheel or twirling a puzzle piece in his hands instead of assembling it. Marito never approached other children on the playground, and if someone approached him, he acted as if the other child didn't exist. Sometimes he would run away and hide, covering his eyes or ears with his hands. There were times when Marito suddenly got angry at his mother or grandmother. In such moments, he would wave his hands at them, scream, and then retreat to his room, where he would hide under the bed for hours. However, Sarah and her mother adored Marito, and despite all the boy's peculiarities, they loved and pampered him. Sarah was gradually coming to terms with her enforced solitude, and her maternal instincts blossomed like a flower. Of course, she had to work. Sarah got a job as a sales clerk in a shoe store, but she spent all her free time with Marito. She patiently worked with him, read to him, and bathed him. Marito grew up in an atmosphere of love and care. However, as he got older, it became more apparent that he was different from others. Sometimes he behaved very strangely. He could sit in one spot for hours, staring at a single point and not responding to anyone, as if he were in a parallel world. Marito still spoke very little, but sometimes he said odd phrases that neither his mother nor grandmother could understand where he had heard them. These moments worried Sarah, and she didn't know what to do about them. Her friends advised her to take Marito to a doctor or psychologist, but Sarah knew that professional services were expensive, so she continued to delay. However, when Marito turned 6, Sarah started thinking about enrolling him in school and realized that it would be very difficult for him there. The young woman found a psychologist, and she and Marito went to see her. The psychologist was an elderly, very experienced woman who suggested that Sarah wait in the corridor. She took a large basket of small toys and a box of sand out of a cabinet and invited Marito to choose any characters and play with them. Marito's eyes lit up, and the hour and a half flew by unnoticed. He didn't realize that he wasn't just playing with toys and sand, but undergoing a real diagnosis by a specialist. Then the psychologist invited Sarah in and told her that Marito had autism. "What should we do now?" Sarah asked in shock, feeling tears well up in her eyes. "There's only one thing you can do: be patient, show kindness and attention, and firmly believe in your son. Autistic individuals are very sensitive and know how others feel about them. You can't hide the truth from them." Sniffling, Sarah nodded. "Yes, I've noticed that," she said. "Sometimes I would come home from work tired or upset but pretended everything was fine. However, Marito would immediately sense my state and try to comfort me." "That's right," agreed the psychologist, putting the toys back in the basket one by one. Sarah stood up, ready to leave. "If you provide Marito with emotional comfort," said the psychologist, looking up, "give him a sense of confidence and security, he will grow up to be a happy person despite everything." Sarah forced a smile and thanked the woman sincerely. "Thank you for your kindness," she replied quietly. She left the office, collected Marito from the playroom, and headed home with a heavy heart. Sarah told her mother about the conversation with the psychologist, and her mother just shrugged in response. "No matter what diagnosis they give him, our Marito will always be Marito. We will still love and adore him, right?" she said wisely. Sarah agreed with her, but her mind was swarming with thoughts about the special attention and care Marito needed. To help him develop, he needs special activities, Sarah decided, and began to study materials on autism available online. A week later, she visited the psychologist again to consult about school for Marito. "Should my son attend classes with regular children, or should I look for a special class?" Sarah asked for advice. "The best option for you and your boy is inclusive education," the psychologist replied. "Marito needs to get used to living in the real world as it is." Sarah thanked the woman and went home, firmly intending to enroll her son in the nearest school the next day. However, her plans were not meant to be. By evening, Marito developed a high fever, and Sarah had to call for emergency help. The boy was taken to the hospital, and his mother went with him. "What's wrong with my son?" she asked the doctor when he came out to her in the corridor. "I'm sorry, but Marito is seriously ill. He has major immune system issues. It's probably a consequence of birth trauma. He needs thorough examination. But I wanted to enroll him in school tomorrow," Sarah stammered in shock. She couldn't believe how quickly her familiar life was falling apart. "I'm sorry, but Marito will have to stay in the hospital for a while. It may even take months. It all depends on the test results." Sarah gasped. She hadn't realized it was so serious. "Doctor," she cried, "please promise me you'll help my boy. He's already been through so much. I don't want him to suffer." The doctor tried to comfort the young woman, saying he would do everything in his power to make Marito recover as soon as possible. Sarah gratefully shook his hand. "Now you should go home and get some rest. Marito is already asleep and won't wake up until tomorrow morning." The young woman nodded and headed for the exit. She walked without noticing anyone around, feeling like her legs were made of lead. Sarah didn't remember how she got home and told her mother, who was still awake, worrying about her grandson. The two women cried and, exhausted by the evening's worries, fell asleep. In the morning, Sarah immediately went to the hospital. Marito was feeling a bit better but was still pale. He was very happy to see his mother. "Will you take me home?" he asked. Sarah shook her head, gently stroking his hand. "Not today, baby. Your doctor wants to understand why you got sick. But I will be here with you." "I don't like it here," Marito admitted. "I'm scared." "But why?" Sarah asked. "I'm afraid I'll have to stay here forever," the boy whispered. Sarah hugged him tightly. "That won't happen," she assured him. "As soon as you get better, we'll go home. Do you promise?" Marito asked with tears in his eyes. "I swear," Sarah replied, almost crying herself. She felt so sorry for her son, but there was nothing she could do. A little later, she met with Marito's doctor, who said the initial test results were ready. "Unfortunately, they're not encouraging. Marito needs expensive treatment," the doctor said. Sarah was shocked by the news. "But we don't have much money. I live with my mother, and we don't earn much," she explained. The doctor just shrugged. "I understand, but there's nothing we can do about that. Maybe you can get a loan from the bank?" Sarah nodded. "Okay, I'll try." She said goodbye to Marito, who was about to take his afternoon nap, and headed straight to the bank. The bank officer listened to her story attentively and promised to do everything possible to help Sarah. He assured her that he would have an answer the next day. The young woman anxiously awaited the bank's call. The evening dragged on too slowly, and she couldn't sleep at night. She managed to doze off only at dawn, and the alarm woke her up early. It was time to get ready to go to the hospital to see Marito. Sarah's mother had brewed fresh coffee and placed freshly baked buns in front of her daughter. The young woman looked gratefully at the elderly senora. "What would I do without you, Mom?" she said. Her mother came closer and hugged her daughter. "We're family, dear. No matter what happens, I'll always support you and Marito." Sarah smiled through her tears and started breakfast. Then she immediately went to the hospital. Marito was eagerly waiting for her. He told her about a dream he had the night before. In the dream, Marito was flying on a large purple elephant. "What a wonderful dream!" Sarah smiled. "We became friends," Marito added. "And I named him Benito." "That's amazing," his mom responded, gently brushing a lock of hair from her son's forehead. The boy suddenly fell silent, looking scared. "What's wrong?" Sarah asked, worried. "Mom," Marito whispered tragically, "I can't tell you. I'm scared." Sarah also became frightened. "Tell me," the young woman said, composing herself. "Maybe the fear will lessen if you share it with me." Marito took a deep breath and closed his eyes. "I think there's a ghost living under my bed," he blurted out. Sarah exhaled in relief. "Let me take a look," she said, bending down. After a pause, she straightened up and shook her head. "It seems empty there, Marito. The ghost must have moved away." "Are you sure?" the boy asked. He was too weak to look under the bed himself. "Yes, 100% sure," Sarah nodded. "What if it comes back tonight?" Marito persisted. "I'll talk to it," his mom said. Marito covered his mouth with his hand. "That's dangerous," he whispered faintly. "We'll come up with something if it returns," Sarah promised, and Marito trustingly snuggled up to her. The young woman barely held back her tears. Life was already difficult for Marito, and now there was this illness. Just then, Sarah's phone rang. A clerk from the bank informed her that her loan had been approved and she would receive it in a few days. Sarah sighed in relief and sincerely thanked the young man for the wonderful news. "You've made me very happy," she said before saying goodbye to the bank employee. The loan was supposed to cover 95% of Marito's treatment costs. The rest of the money would have to come from their budget. When Sarah came home, she and her elderly mother sat at the kitchen table and wrote down all their income on a piece of paper, then started thinking about how to cut expenses. They decided to use less water and electricity, give up some food items, and walk to work to save on public transportation fares. Starting the next day, Sarah began leaving the house earlier and walking to the store where she worked as a sales consultant. During these days, Marito was visited by his grandmother. On her way to work, Sarah thought only about her son. How was he doing? What if he got scared again and needed her? These thoughts and worries exhausted the young woman. She started sleeping poorly at night and constantly felt tired, barely dragging her feet. One day, while Sarah was standing at a traffic light, she was so deep in thought that she didn't even notice a fancy Jeep stop nearby. The window rolled down, and the driver called out to her. "Excuse me," he said. "I don't mean to intrude, but it seems to me that you don't look well." Sarah started and looked at the man who spoke to her. He appeared to be around 35 years old, with some gray streaks in his hair. His eyes were light blue and very kind. Sarah wanted to say she was fine, but she couldn't. She realized that would be a lie, and she didn't want to lie to those clear eyes. "You're right, I'm a bit tired," she replied. "Maybe I can help you." "Where are you going?" "I'll give you a ride," the man said. Sarah raised her eyebrows in surprise, not believing what she heard. I'm not used to going to work by car," she quietly admitted. "It's very simple," the man smiled. "You just need to sit next to me." Sarah smiled back. She had heard many scary stories about women disappearing after getting into a car with a stranger, but she didn't feel any danger from this man. On the contrary, she felt that the man who spoke to her had the most honest and decent intentions. She had the impression that he had been through a lot in life and now just wanted to help. Sarah decided to trust her intuition. "Okay," she said, "but I'll pay you." The man laughed, and Sarah really liked his good-natured laugh. "Oh no. Don't even think about it. I just want to help you from the bottom of my heart." With these words, he got out of the car and opened the passenger door for Sarah. The young woman cautiously sat in the luxurious interior and placed her bag on her lap. Soft music was playing in the car. Sarah really wanted to relax and forget everything, but she remembered that she was in a car with a stranger, albeit a very nice-looking one, and she had to stay alert. "My name is Antonio," the man introduced himself as he returned to the driver's seat. "Sarah," the young woman replied. "Nice to meet you," Antonio said politely, and Sarah nodded in response. The Jeep smoothly pulled away. Sarah barely felt the movement. It was so comfortable to be in the car's luxurious interior. She wanted to close her eyes again and drive somewhere for a long time, forgetting her worries and sorrows. "What do you do, Sarah?" Antonio asked. "I work in a shoe store," she replied. "I help women choose beautiful shoes." "Wonderful job," the man smiled, carefully watching the road but occasionally glancing at Sarah. "And you?" the young woman dared to ask. "I work in investments," the man replied briefly. Sarah nodded. She absent-mindedly looked out the window at the familiar buildings. At that moment, they were driving past the hospital where Marito was, and Sarah instinctively leaned forward. Antonio noticed this movement. "What upset you?" he asked, surprised. Sarah glanced at him sideways, deciding whether to tell him about her trouble. "My son Marito. He's only 6, she finally said. "He's very sick." "I'm sorry," Antonio replied sincerely, giving the young woman a compassionate look. "But what happened?" Sarah bit her lip. "Complications from birth trauma," she replied without going into details. After a pause, she added, "Marito. Well, he's a special boy." "In what way?" Antonio asked. "In that he's autistic," Sarah admitted. She thought she saw Antonio grip the steering wheel a little tighter for a moment. "I understand," he replied, not looking at his passenger. Sarah felt that Antonio was somewhere far away at that moment. When they stopped at the store where she worked, Sarah thanked the man sincerely. "You've helped me a lot," she admitted. "Thank you for your kindness." Antonio nodded slightly, smiling. Then he paused for a moment, as if remembering something, and opened the glove compartment. "I want to give your son something," he said. Sarah raised her eyebrows in surprise. "Give him something? But why?" "I hope he'll like this gift," Antonio said. He took out a bright object from the glove compartment and held it out to Sarah in his open palm. She stared at it in astonishment. It was an ordinary Rubik's Cube. Sarah took the toy. "Thank you," she whispered. Antonio smiled at Sarah, and she thought she saw a flicker of sadness in his eyes. "If you ever need my help again, here's my card," Antonio said as Sarah placed the cube in her bag and reached for the door handle. He handed the young woman a business card, and she glanced at it briefly before putting it in her pocket. She managed to read that Antonio's last name was Perez. "Thank you again," she said goodbye and disappeared into the store building. The woman thought she would never see Antonio again. But Sarah was wrong. When she next went to the hospital to visit Marito, she gave him the man's gift. The boy was very surprised but interested in the cube. Sarah explained to him how to move the colored squares and what the goal was, and Marito became engrossed in the game. Then the young woman was invited to her son's doctor's office, and she left the room. "I have good news," the smiling doctor said cheerfully to Sarah. "Marito's treatment is going well. His body is getting stronger every day. Follow-up tests show very good results. I think Marito will be able to leave the hospital and return to his normal life in about a week." Sarah didn't immediately believe what she heard. She felt a rush of joy and almost hugged the doctor. "Doctor, thank you. I'm so happy to hear this." The doctor nodded and smiled back. I must admit, part of the success is due to me, but most of it is Marito's doing. He is a very strong boy who deserves the best in life. Sarah agreed with him. You mentioned you were going to enroll him in school, the doctor recalled. Yes, the young woman nodded. But I think we'll have to wait. I believe Marito will go to school next academic year. The doctor rubbed his chin, thinking. Then you should find some developmental activities for Marito. It will help him a lot in school. Sarah nodded again. Of course, I'll take care of that very soon, she replied. When Sarah entered her son's room, she was astonished to see a solved cube on the boy's nightstand. Who helped you do this? The young woman asked Marito. One of the doctors? Marito just shook his head in response. I solved the cube myself, he replied. At first, it took me about half an hour, then 10 minutes, and finally, I managed to do it in 5. Sarah couldn't believe what she heard. Seriously? But it's quite a complex process. I heard you need to know special algorithms. At that moment, a nurse who was tidying up the medicine table in the room joined the conversation. You know, there are speed cubing clubs in many cities? Maybe you should enroll Marito in one, she suggested. Sarah looked at the woman in confusion. But what is speed cubing? She asked. In these clubs, kids compete to set records for solving Rubik's cubes quickly, the nurse replied. I know this because my nephew, who lives in the capital, attends such a club twice a week. Sarah, who had initially listened to the woman's words with hope and inspiration, now looked somewhat disappointed. But that's in the capital, she said. I don't think there's anything like that in our town. Why don't you check? The nurse advised. Maybe you'll find something. Sarah agreed and, as soon as she got home, turned on her laptop and searched for her town's name and the word speed cubing. The result surprised her. There was a center for special needs children not far from their home where they could join a speed cubing club. Sarah registered Marito online, signing him up for his first class in 10 days. As the doctor promised, Marito was discharged from the hospital in a week. The first few days, he readjusted to being home, and then came that Tuesday when his first speed cubing class was to take place. Sarah dressed Marito in a short-sleeved shirt and dress pants to make the day more memorable. Somehow, the young woman felt it would be a special and transformative day for him. And so it was. When Sarah and Marito approached the children's center, they were impressed by its beauty and neatness. The boy immediately wanted to come here every day. Sarah smiled and led her son to the door. In the lobby, they were greeted by a polite and friendly receptionist. How can I help you? She asked. We signed up for our first speed cubing class at your center, Sarah explained. The girl nodded. Let me show you to the classroom. Please follow me. She stepped out from behind the desk and led Sarah and Marito to the elevators. You have such a modern building, Sarah remarked in surprise. We have a sponsor who bought it for us, the girl smiled. He does a lot for special needs children. The elevator opened, and the girl led Sarah and Marito down a wide, bright corridor decorated with children's drawings. She stopped by one of the doors, knocked, and opened it. Following the girl, Sarah and Marito entered a spacious but cozy classroom with new tables and chairs. Posters and a whiteboard for markers were on the walls, where a young man, apparently the teacher, was writing some algorithms. But all this went unnoticed by Sarah because the first thing that caught her eye was a portrait of a man who seemed vaguely familiar to her. She didn't immediately realize where she had seen him, and when it dawned on her, Sarah gasped in surprise, unable to believe her eyes. The man in the painting was the same one who once gave her and Marito a ride and gifted him a small but precious present. That's Antonio Perez, Sarah exclaimed. Surprisingly, the man in the painting was also holding a Rubik's Cube. Yes, the receptionist nodded politely. He is our sponsor. He does a lot for the center. That's why we have his portrait in many classrooms. It's our way of showing Senor Antonio our respect and appreciation. Besides, his example serves as an inspiration to all our students. Inspiration? Sarah didn't understand. The girl looked at her attentively and began to explain. Yes, you probably didn't know that Antonio was once a special child himself. He was diagnosed with autism in childhood. Sarah couldn't believe her ears. So that's why Antonio gave Marito the Rubik's Cube. He knew it would help his development. Other students started entering the classroom. Sarah kissed Marito on the forehead and left the room with the receptionist. While they were descending in the elevator to the first floor, Sarah told her that it was Antonio who sparked Marito's interest in the Rubik's Cube. Oh, didn't you know that Senor Antonio's life success story is closely connected with speed cubing? The girl asked. Sarah just shook her head. We're not that closely acquainted, she said. At that moment, they reached the reception desk, and the receptionist was distracted by other parents. So Sarah decided to look up information about Antonio Perez online. She sat on a couch where parents waited for their children and took her smartphone out of her bag. She found Antonio Perez easily. Sarah looked at his photos in amazement. In some, he was a child holding a Rubik's Cube, in others, he was receiving an award at a speed cubing championship, and in others, he was shaking hands with the mayor of the capital. Sarah was about to read one of the articles about the man when she suddenly heard someone call her name. She looked up and saw Antonio himself. He was standing at the receptionist's desk, smiling at her. The young woman blushed and adjusted her bangs. Antonio nodded briefly to the receptionist and walked toward Sarah. Good afternoon, Sarah, he greeted the young woman. Hello, Antonio, she replied, standing up from the couch. I didn't expect to see you here, he admitted. Sarah noted briefly that Antonio was impeccably dressed. He wore a light peach shirt and gray trousers. I brought my son to his first speed cubing class, Sarah explained. He really liked your gift. Antonio tilted his head and smiled. I'm very glad it worked out that way. And, of course, I'm happy to see you again. Bright sparks flashed in his kind eyes. Sarah felt herself blushing. The lesson just started, right? Antonio clarified. Yes, 5 minutes ago, Sarah confirmed. Antonio ruffled his hair somewhat awkwardly. We could have coffee somewhere nearby while your son is in class? I have some free time right now. Sarah felt her heart beat faster with excitement. Antonio's invitation brought out the most positive emotions in her. Of course, why not? She smiled. Antonio nodded and led Sarah to the exit. Across the road from the children's center was a cozy-looking cafe that caught the man's attention. Shall we sit there? He asked Sarah, nodding towards the cafe building. The young woman simply nodded in response. They crossed the road and entered the cafe. A bell tinkled softly on the door, and Sarah immediately felt cozy and calm from the pleasant aroma of coffee and the warm-toned interior. Antonio led Sarah to a free table by the window and, pulling out a chair, helped her sit. Then he sat down opposite. A young waiter approached them. What would you like? He asked, notebook ready. Antonio looked questioningly at his companion. Cappuccino, Sarah replied. And an éclair. I'll have the same, please, said Antonio. I love éclairs. Sarah smiled. In Antonio's company, she always felt relaxed and free, despite the fact that his social status was significantly higher than hers. So, Marito loves speed cubing? Antonio smiled when the waiter moved away from their table. Exactly, Sarah replied. I've wanted to enroll him in developmental activities for a long time. As soon as he was discharged from the hospital, I found your center. It turns out it's near our house. You can't imagine how grateful I am for your help. I hope that now Marito will start a new, happy life full of interesting activities and meetings. It will be so, Antonio nodded, and Sarah once again caught a hint of old sadness in his eyes. Why are you sometimes sad? She couldn't help but ask. Antonio looked into her eyes for a long time. I remember my childhood, he admitted. Sarah nodded understandingly. I've learned a bit about you. Antonio smiled and ruffled his hair again. Sarah liked this habit of his. My childhood wasn't very happy, Antonio unexpectedly said. Most of the time I felt like a black sheep. Oh, I can imagine how hard that is, Sarah said sympathetically, remembering Marito. Yes, Antonio nodded. The waiter approached, carrying a tray with cappuccinos and eclairs. Placing the desserts and drinks on the table, he politely nodded and left. I was born into a loving and caring family, but because of my specialness, the world seemed gray. I didn't always understand what was happening around me. Everything seemed strange and mysterious, as if I had landed on another, unfamiliar planet. This feeling made everything complicated. I was often sick and developed very slowly. The older I got, the more frightening and unpredictable the world around me seemed. It was very hard for me to express my thoughts and feelings. Even my loving parents didn't understand me, and my peers tried not to come near me at all. During walks, I usually sat in the corner of the sandbox, quietly making sandcastles, trying not to look at anyone or attract attention. Sarah sighed sympathetically. She wanted to take Antonio's hand, but she restrained her impulse. My parents immersed themselves in studying autism, trying to understand my characteristics and find a way to help me. They visited specialists, studied therapeutic methods, and strategies for raising autistic children. At home, they created a predictable atmosphere for me to feel safe. Mom invented games to help me develop fine motor skills. Together we assembled puzzles, molded clay, and painted with our fingers. And one day, Dad brought home a Rubik's Cube, and my life turned upside down. Just like Marito, Sarah exclaimed. Yes, Antonio agreed and continued his story. I became obsessed with this game. I didn't part with the cube for a minute and even slept with it. I trained for hours. Soon I could solve it in a minute. Then my parents accidentally found out that there were competitions and even championships in speed cubing. They decided to enroll me no matter what, and they succeeded. When I turned 12, I went with my mom and dad to the capital for the championship. And you won it? Sarah guessed. Antonio took a sip of cappuccino, paused, and nodded. Yes, I became the champion. But participating gave me more than just the grand prize. I made new friends, met important people, and most importantly, I believed in myself. I believed that there was a place for me in this world. Since then, my life changed drastically. I stopped hiding from the world and opened up to it instead. I managed to become a full-fledged member of society and even more. I became wealthy and now invest money in the education and development of children like I once was. Sarah listened to the man, holding her breath. She realized that tears had welled up in her eyes, so deeply had she taken his story to heart. It's magical, she whispered. Antonio felt somewhat embarrassed by her words. I was very lucky, he said quietly. And I'm grateful that I was able to go through this journey and now help others. It's very important, Sarah agreed. While Antonio was talking and she was listening, they completely forgot about the eclairs. Why are we just sitting here? Antonio laughed. Let's have a snack. And they happily started on the eclairs and slightly cooled cappuccino. Everything was delicious, and for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt that she was simply enjoying happy moments without any worries. Maybe my life is about to get better, she thought. But she wasn't sure if she should trust this sudden thought. An hour flew by unnoticed. It was time to return to the children's center to pick up Marito. Antonio paid the bill, leaving a generous tip for the young waiter, and they left the coffee shop. A fresh breeze blew, and the young woman straightened her shoulders, turning her face to it. She didn't notice Antonio watching her, admiration clear in his eyes. The young people crossed the street and entered the center. Antonio offered to accompany Sarah upstairs and also to talk to the speed cubing teacher. As they ascended in the elevator, standing very close to each other, Sarah felt sparks that were clearly noticeable between them. She didn't know how to react to this. Looking into Antonio's eyes, Sarah smiled shyly, and he briefly touched her shoulder with his fingertips. At this touch, Sarah's heart began to pound, and she was afraid Antonio would hear it. Fortunately, the elevator doors opened, and they stepped out into the hallway. From the loud shouts, they immediately realized something extraordinary had happened. Sarah was frightened that something had happened to Marito and rushed to the room where she had left him. Antonio ran after her. A whole crowd had already gathered in the room. There were students of the center, their parents, and some of the administration. Everyone was crowded around one of the tables, forming a tight circle. Marito was nowhere to be seen. What happened? Sarah cried out anxiously. Where's my son? Antonio began to carefully push his way to the center of the circle, constantly apologizing. Sarah followed him. Finally, they managed to get to the desk that the crowd had surrounded, and they saw Marito behind it. He was quietly sitting, paying no attention to anyone else. The boy was completely focused on the Rubik's Cube he was holding in his hands. Sarah noticed that his fingers were moving non-stop. This boy just set a world record for solving the Rubik's Cube. Someone whispered. Sarah couldn't believe her ears or eyes. Marito continued solving the cube. It took him just a few seconds to do it. Antonio stood nearby, looking at Marito in stunned yet joyful amazement. It's just incredible. He smiled. Sarah, your son is a real speed cubing genius. He needs to go to the next World Championship. I'll make all the arrangements today. Sarah felt like she was about to faint from the excitement and happiness that overwhelmed her. She hugged Marito by the shoulders, and he leaned against her back, without taking his eyes off the toy he loved so much. Sarah looked at Antonio with gratitude. Thank you so much for everything you do for us, she whispered. When they got home, Sarah told her mother everything, and she was surprised and delighted by the news. I knew our boy was the best, she said tearfully. That evening, after putting Marito to bed, Sarah and her mother couldn't fall asleep for a long time. They shared their impressions and remembered everything they had been through over the past 6 years. How wonderful it is that God sent me Marito, Sarah said with feeling. I'm so happy to be a mother. You are the best mother in the world, said the elderly woman. After talking heart to heart, they went to their rooms. Sarah changed into her nightgown and took her smartphone to check if she had set the alarm. At that moment, she noticed a message from an unknown number. I hope you and Marito are well. I found out about the championship. It will be held in April. Tomorrow, I'll book tickets for you, Marito, and myself. You don't mind if I accompany you, do you? Sarah guessed that the message was from Antonio. She looked at the clock. It was already too late to call. Sarah decided to reply by message. Wonderful news. Of course, I don't mind. On the contrary, we'll feel much calmer and more comfortable with you. Thank you again for all your efforts, Antonio, she typed and pressed send. The reply came almost instantly. Great. I'm very happy. Sarah and Antonio started seeing each other often at the Children's Center, where Sarah began bringing Marito not only for speed cubing but also for other activities. While the classes were in session, they sat in the cafe across the street, drinking coffee with desserts and talking about everything in the world. They realized they had a lot in common and always had something to talk about. Each time Sarah and Antonio grew closer, becoming good friends. They communicated through messages, wished each other good day in the morning and good night in the evening. Their conversations became more heartfelt, and they could confide their deepest thoughts to each other. Sarah felt attracted to Antonio and saw that it was mutual. They started meeting not only during the classes but also in the evenings, going to the movies and theater when Marito was with his grandmother. After the events, Antonio and Sarah walked the streets for a long time, holding hands. One day they went to a quiet park and sat on a bench by the fountain. The stars shone brightly in the sky. Sarah and Antonio watched them for a long time until suddenly one of the stars fell, leaving a weightless trail. A falling star. Make a wish, Sarah whispered softly so as not to disturb the beauty of the moment. She closed her eyes and thought of Marito. She really wanted him to win the speed cubing championship. Did you make a wish? Antonio whispered, leaning closer to Sarah and inhaling the scent of her hair. Sarah nodded. And you? She asked softly. I did too, Antonio purred. What did you wish for? Sarah asked shyly. She felt the man's breath on her cheek. I wished for you to kiss me, Sarah, Antonio admitted. Sarah blushed and turned to him. Really? She asked. Antonio just nodded in response, moving even closer. Their lips lightly touched and then melted together in a sweet kiss. My wish came true, Antonio whispered a moment later. Sarah smiled in response. They hugged tightly and sat on the bench for a long time, enjoying the magical moments of happiness. And in April, Sarah's wish also came true. Marito became the champion. And in early July, Antonio and Sarah had a beautiful wedding. No one knew, but about 6 months ago, little Marito, sitting by the window in his room and looking at the starry sky, had wished, I want my mom to be happy. It turns out, the boy's wish also came true.